No, China's economy won't collapse, as so many finance YouTubers are claiming. YouTube was filled with these sorts of thumbnails, so I chose to tap on one: China is disintegrating, and another: complete breaking down of the Chinese economy, and another: and how this could quite literally lead China to the edge of the next Great Depression in a very short amount of time. And an extremely short measure of the time is apparently 29, 28, 27, 25 days. Sure, China is by all accounts in hot water with a gigantic real estate crisis, bank runs, brutal coronavirus lockdowns, capital flight, and a development model that has quite literally hit a dead end. However, as I see it, the clickbait Great Depression or complete collapse scenario is very unlikely for two reasons. First, China's political system is nothing similar to that of the US when it entered the Great Depression in the early 20s. Second, China's economy is nothing similar to that of Asian economies that are collapsing, like Sri Lanka. So how about we get into these two distinctions? Welcome to Bulls and Bears. If you're new to the channel, hit the like button and subscribe if you enjoy our content. Now, let's go back to the video. Of course, at first sight, China's circumstances appear to be a lot like the collapse of US banking systems in the early 1920s and 2008. These two banking crises prompted economic collapses that were very disastrous to the point that they came to be known as the Great Depression and the Great Recession, respectively. So let's examine how China's circumstances compare to these two important events. The narrative of the Great Depression of the early 20s begins with an epic growth of bank lending, as well as an enormous increase in asset prices, mainly in the stock market. Similarly, the narrative of the Great Recession begins with epic credit growth, matched with large asset price increases, mostly in property and the stock market. Up until this point, this is very much like China's story. From 2009 onwards, Chinese banks and other financial institutions went on a lending spree, causing an enormous spike in property prices. This ended up making Chinese cities like Shenzhen and Shanghai 4 times more costly compared to income than a city like New York in 2020. Up to this point, they are very much alike. However, asset prices compared with the size of the economy can't rise forever. So asset prices needed to come down sooner or later in every one of the 3 cases. Then, in each of the 3 cases, banks that made loans backed by these assets began to fail. Uncertain of whether their cash was safe or not, individuals began to demand their cash back from the banks. And in any modern banking system, all individuals wanting their cash back simultaneously is essentially unrealistic. So, in each of the 3 cases, individuals wanted to be the first to get their cash out of the banking system, igniting a bank run. This is where China is currently, and this is also where the narratives of the Great Recession and Great Depression begin to diverge. At the beginning of the Great Depression in the early 20s, the US central bank essentially let the banking system collapse. What's more, if we look at things objectively, for any ordinary business that gets into trouble, it's totally common for the government to simply allow it to collapse. The issue is that as a system, banks facilitate both payments and credit creation for the whole economy. So letting them collapse is a bit like letting all your electricity companies collapse simultaneously. It very well may be legitimate according to an ethical viewpoint. However, you kill your whole economy in the process. In the case of the US, it required 10 years for the economy to recover. However, in 2008, in the wake of seeing the damage done by the collapse of the Lehman Brothers Bank, the Federal Reserve Bank wound up rescuing the financial system. Again, not fair to allow bankers to get away with blowing a bubble. However, the US figured out a way to avoid another Great Depression and wound up with a milder Great Recession. And this is where you will find out why China's story is not quite the same as the Great Depression of the early 20s, as well as the Great Recession of 2008. Very much like the Great Recession, China's central bank is very much aware of the risks of letting your complete credit and monetary system collapse, only for the sake of teaching individuals a thing or two. It has proactively lowered its interest rates and begun rescuing both banks and property developers. Furthermore, China's story is currently not the same as the Great Recession in two other significant ways. First, its banking system is already generally state-owned. So, a run to get paper money from these banks would be short-lived since China's central bank can undoubtedly provide it. Second, in contrast to US politicians who waited for the bubble to collapse on its own, the Chinese bubble was popped by the government itself. In particular, when it implemented the Three Red Lines policy, which required bad property developers to begin deleveraging. So, in summary, China's economy won't fall in the US-style Great Depression exactly, because China's national bank has learned the most important lesson from the US Great Depression. Yes, reckless behavior by banks should be punished, but not by crashing your whole economy. In addition, I believe China's crisis won't actually be as serious as the Great Recession. The reason for this is that the Chinese government values stability more than the US government. Along these lines, I suspect it will attempt to spend its way out of trouble more forcefully. However, at that point, you might say, you can't compare China with the US because the US issues the global reserve currency. It has more space to spend its way out of trouble since it's fundamentally financed by foreign countries that desperately need dollars. What's more, one critical component of China's ongoing issues is that global investors appear to be fleeing the country in droves. In this way, perhaps it should not be compared with the US, but rather to other Asian economies that are currently collapsing in an inflationary death spiral, like Sri Lanka. Well, no, and here's the reason why. The reason why China can save its banking system if it needs to is that, unlike Sri Lanka, China has accomplished monetary independence. Furthermore, it has accomplished this in two ways. The first way was by turning into a manufacturing superpower. By the most recent estimations, it represents 1/5 of the world's manufacturing output. Therefore, it's not shocking that China has reliably run a trade surplus with the rest of the world. As China's economy slows down, and therefore imports less, its trade surplus has even increased to all-time highs. In other words, the world needs Chinese products. Therefore, although it doesn't give the world's reserve currency, its central bank has a lot of dollars to spend. What's more, in need, it will probably spend these to protect the currency and effortlessly offset the impact of fleeing global investors. This will assist it in staying away from a Sri Lanka-style collapse. However, as we found out in February, when the Russian ruble totally collapsed, a trade surplus alone isn't sufficient. Russia's problem at the time was that while numerous dollars were coming into central bank coffers through exports, Russian citizens were hurrying to get much more cash out of the country. This was no different for Turkey, where individuals have no faith in the government and hence unloaded liras to purchase gold, crypto, and dollars. And this brings us to the second way in which China has accomplished monetary independence, and that is through capital controls. Capital controls essentially mean that you make it very hard for cash to cross borders. And, in China's situation, it's famously challenging to get cash out of China as the Chinese government prevents individuals from taking cash out of the country. This is the same type of policy that Russia began implementing in response to Western sanctions. And this clearly helped Russia rescue its cash and avoid a Sri Lanka-style collapse. And the blend of capital controls and the trade surplus means that very much like the US, China has the monetary freedom to make as much of its currency as it needs to protect its banking system, making a total collapse incredibly impossible. However, that being said, China is still in some hot water. In outright size, its property bubble is the greatest the world has ever seen. Furthermore, while it's popping the bubble itself, its government has harmed its economy at the same time in three other primary ways. First, its one-child policy from the past now means that it is confronting a fast population decrease in the coming decades. More immediately, it is keeping its consumers from spending more by keeping them locked up inside because of Omicron. Finally, it is taking action against its somewhat productive tech and education industries, and the private sector in general. However, since it has accomplished monetary independence and likely learned the lessons from the US Great Depression, I simply don't feel that it will crumble. regardless of the numerous sensationalist YouTubers who will attempt to let you know the opposite. Instead, I feel that a short recession, followed by significant government intervention, and then a time of stagnation and slow decline like Japan, is the most probable scenario. But hey, I'm intentionally saying scenario. In macroeconomics, very much like in politics, I believe it's useful to think in scenarios and then give these a probability. To me, the sensationalist YouTuber collapse scenario is similar to tossing 2 dice and hitting a double 6. It's conceivable, but it's very unlikely given Xi's attention and social stability and China's monetary independence. Then again, I believe that a sustainable economic recovery resembles hitting double 5, double 4, or double 3. More likely, but still far-fetched. Finally, any remaining combinations of the dice represent a Japan-style stagnation scenario. But what do you think? What is the probability of each scenario that I have mentioned? Do you have other scenarios that you think I might have missed? Let me know in the comments below. If you enjoy this video, hit that subscribe button, click on the notification bell to be updated on our new videos. See you in our next video!